Hi Divya, how are you doing?
Doing well. How are you?
Doing good, doing good.
Excellent. Excited for today's.
Yeah, so am I. I thought we'll take a simple topic. It just says, are you open-minded?
Perfect. Let's do it.
Okay, so let's get started. So maybe Divya, let me ask you this question. Do you think you're open-minded?
I think I could do better, Suman, honestly speaking. I try to be,
Oh,
but I think I can do better.
okay, okay. I mean, thanks again for being so candid. You've always been very candid. I have asked myself this question often, and I think overall I feel I'm quite open-minded. But the problem is this, that research indicates that most people overestimate themselves. In fact, 95% of people rated themselves as more open minded than average. So I
Which is
think that,
impossible.
yeah, that's kind of a little scary, isn't it? I think it goes back to self reflection again, right? Self awareness. Maybe the question needs to be posed to somebody else as to whether they think we are open minded.
Absolutely.
So the question is how much, right? I mean, if we are not open minded at all, we are seen as rigid or stubborn. On the other hand, you can also, it's not good to be too open minded also, because then you're gullible, you're fickle. So it's kind of a continuum, and we need a balance. But the challenge is, where is that balance? Who decides? I mean, we only decide, which also means our biases keep coming in, isn't it? So that becomes a big problem. So they actually talk about this very simple but nice concept, which I like, which is called intellectual humility. And I think that is something that sits between these two excesses. Um, on one side, it's the willingness to change, and on the other side, the wisdom to know when you shouldn't, right? Which is about conviction. So it's really about a balance. So let me take a pause.
Hey, Suman. Yeah, I was just creating a Mentza. I really like what you just said. So going back to open-mindedness, right?
Yeah,
And it's beautiful you bring up biases because one is, of course, to overestimate our abilities. I love the 95% thinking that they are more open-minded than average.
yeah,
This brings me to something called, and you've heard of it, right? Confirmation bias and wayside bias, right? So
yeah,
as human beings, we are very, very wired to kind of look at information that supports our own beliefs and discard information that doesn't, right?
absolutely.
So we go after, and that's the reason for all the polarization that we see in the world today, that liberals tend to read liberal newspapers, conservatives tend to read conservative newspapers. I see a different Twitter than a right wing. It sees a different Twitter, different feed, so on and so forth, right? And
Right.
why? Because of the fundamental human nature to kind of get your first beliefs confirmed, right?
Yeah,
The
yeah,
beliefs that you already hold. And open mindedness is that effort that you need to put in to go beyond that, right? You need to literally tame that bias, right? You need to literally put yourself and say, I want to look for evidence that doesn't just confirm my beliefs. I want to look for evidence for different ideas, right?
yeah, yeah.
And very, very few people are able to do that, right, Suman? So when you talked about open-mindedness, the first thing that came to my mind is how much of opposite of how we're wired to, the confirmation bias, and how much you need to really put effort to mitigate that.
Absolutely. You're absolutely spot on. And see, it's just, for instance, if you had a different viewpoint than mine, even if you were reading the same newspaper, I would only focus on information which confirms what I believe, right? So same information, both of us would interpret it differently, which is really about confirmation bias, as you rightly pointed out.
Exactly.
But at the same time, if both of us are reading different newspapers which tend to exaggerate, our viewpoints, then it just becomes worse. And I think that's the polarization that's happening.
Absolutely. And Suman, so how does one, right? So actively, we've talked about this in a few circles, right? Where you need to have I love what the term you used, which is intellectual humility,
Mhm.
because that term means that you put yourself out there to differing points of opinion. You know that yours is not the end all and be all belief, right? You're willing to be receptive to other beliefs. How
Yeah.
does one, in your experience, cultivate some of those, right? How do you become intellectually humble in that? If that
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And there are a few things that we can do. And maybe the first one we can talk about, which is very important, is to just have respect for other viewpoints. It's easier said than done, but we have to ask ourselves that question, right? Do we have the respect? Do we have the trust of the person who we are speaking with? The other thing is, are we being selective, right? We're talking of biases. Again, these biases keep creeping in, right? For instance, we could be open to our boss, but not to our team members. In a team meeting, we could be open to some team members who are our favorites and not be open to others. And let's face it, we are all human. So these things always play out, right? And I think we need to be aware of it, because it's not that the best ideas will come from people who are only your favorites, right? So since we are talking of biases, a bias like a halo effect, for instance, right? Which is the tendency for the initial impression to influence what we think, can play a very strong role. And once we kind of are open, once we kind of decide to approach somebody with respect, I think we also need to bring in curiosity. Because if you're not curious enough to listen to the other viewpoints, you aren't really being open-minded. And when I was looking at these, I was also trying to link it to some of the stories. So the other day, I was going through the Steve Jobs story, and I thought, a lot of the things I could connect. So Steve Jobs, for instance, was very intense, right? But it says that he was extremely passionate. On one hand, he could also be cold and brutal on the other, right? Um, to me, that shows his respect for other viewpoints also varied tremendously. So I'm not getting into whether it's good or bad, but the point is we need to be aware. So yeah, that's the first one. We need to respect other viewpoints. Make sense?
absolutely, absolutely, and therefore, then there is a lot of non-rigidity in your thinking, a lot of flexibility, and then right. And now my thoughts are running away with me. It's very very close to being creative, right? Because
Yeah.
being creative means that flexibility comes in, right? In your thought process. So is there a link, Suman? Do Are creative people, this is something that I should go read up, but are creative people more likely to be more open minded, do you think, or not?
Um, I'm not very sure about that. Maybe they could be, they need not be also. Some people are inherently more creative. Uh, the question is, are they open to others' viewpoints?
Yeah.
Right. And I think Steve Jobs is a great example, right? He was extremely creative himself. And there are points in time where he has not been open to others' viewpoints. And there have been points where he has been very open to others' viewpoints, right? Uh, all that we are saying is when you're open-minded, you're taking in more information, your decision making is better.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes
Yeah.
sense. And also, then it's a very thin line between being open minded and being indecisive, Suman. And where does so being open minded doesn't mean that you're indecisive, right? It just means that you can process more information, differing information, and then take that decision that you need to take, right? So,
Absolutely. Absolutely. I fully agree. So being decisive, I think it's a slightly different thing where there is a time element to it. It's about taking quick decisions, maintaining clarity, maintaining the quality of the decision. Right. But I think that's the first step, right? You asked to go back to your previous question, what do we need to do? So one is respect for others' viewpoints. But I think we need to do more than that. And the second one is what is called not being intellectually overconfident. And I think this is the tricky one. Right. So for instance, if I'm talking to you, I may be respecting your viewpoints, but I may be processing it in my head and saying, no, but my viewpoint is better than what Divya is saying. Right. Now, what I'm doing in the process is I'm being intellectually overconfident. And this is something that a lot of us face, especially senior leaders in organizations, they face it a lot. Right. At which point does confidence become overconfidence? Right. It's that tipping point when our strength becomes a weakness. And the better and more senior we get with time, we build more conviction in our own thought process. And hence we tend to stick more to our own viewpoints. Since you're talking of bias, I think there's a bias called the egocentric bias. It essentially causes people to rely too heavily on their point of view. And why I'm saying this is tricky is at what point do you say, you know what? maybe this guy's got a point. Maybe, what I'm saying, maybe I need to look at it from a different point of view, right? Since I was talking of Steve Jobs, so there's another story where, he was he showed his passion. It was almost like an obsession for design, right? So after he was kind of removed, sacked from Apple, he started his Next Computers, and he was obsessed with the design. It had to be an absolutely perfect cube, each side exactly 1 foot long, every angle precisely 90 degrees. He spent a fortune on the logo. Eventually, the product bombed. Yeah. For starters, it was a nightmare to manufacture the perfect cube, but he would have it no other way. Okay. So that same obsession, okay, I think at some point it became intellectually overconfident. And the same Steve Jobs, there are other stories also. For instance, the iPod. Critics said no one would pay $400 for a music player. Then the iPhone came out. Everybody said, nobody's going to pay $500 for a phone. But every time he proved them wrong. So the point is, you only have to decide where is that balance, right? So we have to be, there's a very thin line between being confident and being overconfident. And it's up to us to figure out where that is.
Absolutely. I think, Sumaya, do you want to? I see you've joined the speaker panel. Do you want to come in? We're talking about open mindedness.
No, I just joined. I'm just trying to figure out what discussion is going on. So no
Awesome.
worries.
Okay, great. So if you want to jump in at any point, do let us know. Yeah. And Suman, to what you just said, I think a willingness to change and actually changing your beliefs, right, are two different things. And what you said kind of struck me because I could have all of the willingness, right, saying that I will try to be open mindedness, or
Yeah.
when it comes, I will try to be open minded. But when it comes to it, do I actually change my beliefs, right, or not? And I think there was this really, really lovely study that had been done just to show you how learning and
Mm-hmm.
striving and really working at it can help, right? There was a lovely study that happened where you put people, and it's also a little scary, right? You put people of different, so they put people of different races of course, they were studying their brains, right? And
Mm-hmm.
when they were so suppose, let's say they took a Indian and they showed Caucasian, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now a different race, what happens is that the insula, which is the brain region that processes kind of disgust and fear, right, it
Mm-hmm.
kind of activates. But what happens, right, it's in microseconds, right? What happens right after that is that the prefrontal cortex, which has all the learning, which is all the stuff that we're learning, right, it
Mm-hmm.
kicks in to inhibit that disgust, that emotional response, right? And therefore all the learning comes in with full force to quell that. And now where people haven't learned, right, you know what happens, right, where there is just that emotional response which is not being mediated or inhibited by the other response, right? So I
Yeah.
think putting yourself out, in the space of differing viewpoints, learning, having that humility to change will be the only thing that really does help us overcome the initial bias, which is always going to be conformed to the beliefs, right? But I think the
Absolutely.
learning has a big, big role.
Absolutely. And I think there is one more thing which is very important. I talked of respect for those viewpoints, and I talked of not being overconfident. Now, in our example, let's say two of us are discussing. I respect your viewpoint, and you saying something, and I'm not being intellectually overconfident. Okay, and I think maybe I should go with what Divya is saying. But there is a third part which is very big, which is to separate one's ego from one's intellect, right? I still have to admit that, yeah, you know what, maybe you have a better idea and let's go with that. And that requires a lot of humility, a lot of vulnerability. See, we all have our egos, right? Um, so if you think you don't have an ego, here's a simple question. Do you have a persistent need to be right during arguments or to win the argument? And if your answer is yes, right there, that's your ego at play. And we need to be aware of it. And we have to be careful that our ego does not take over. We need to be a little vulnerable, like I said initially, right? To accept that maybe you're wrong. That little bit of self-doubt, self-doubt, they say, is not good, but little bit of self-doubt, that little bit of vulnerability can go a long way in separating the ego from the intellect. And again, I was trying to link this to the Steve Jobs story. So in 1997, when he came back as CEO, even though he was a brilliant designer himself, he kept his ego aside and he brought in a phenomenally talented designer named John Ivey. And the story goes that together they built the iMac, which went on to become the fastest selling computer for them. So why I like the Steve Jobs story is fascinating. How he kind of kept on learning. On one hand, while he had a lot of ego and creativity, but he knew when to put it aside, when to kind of recognize talent and bring in the person and work together. So I think those three, again, as I said, it's easier said than done. But if you're able to bring those three elements together, then we are in the right path of being open-minded.
That is
So
go.
yeah. There's like the discussion is beautifully going on, and I feel that I should have joined early. It is just coming to my mind that many people have this thing, the ego thing that he defined very well. How can we get people out of that state when they are open minded? Actually, they become open minded because ego is with everyone, right? How can you change people's perspective when it comes to your kids or your nearest and closest friend, and you see that because of their ego, they're not able to grow? You know how do we deal with them?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I think it all starts with awareness, and ego is the last one, right? So first we have to respect the other's viewpoints and not be overconfident. If you are aware of that yes, maybe I should go with the other with the differing viewpoint, that's when we need to keep our ego aside, right? And that's, I think that's where the humility comes in, and that's where the vulnerability comes in. There's a talk about psychological safety in organizations, which is really about nothing more than being vulnerable. When a senior leader in the organization says, "Look, I don't know, maybe or I may be wrong here," what he's signaling is that, look, he or she doesn't have all the answers, and that creates a space for people to speak up and be vulnerable.
Yeah, Divya, please go on. You sharing.
Yeah, Suman, and the Holy Trinity, right? The three things that you just said are super hard. And any other tips, any other activities or exercises that one can do? And one, I think, what you mentioned is reflection. If I were to take down points and action points for myself, right? I would a say reflection. I would say put yourself, be go seeking, be curious, go seeking different perspectives for the whys, right? Ask why more and go seeking knowledge. Three is just be aware of your ego, right? Be aware when and this goes back to our conversation on being mindful of the emotions that are creeping up, right?
Yes,
And
yes.
being responsive and not reactive. So that's the number three. Am I missing out any other action points, Suman, that we can actually take back to do what Sumaya was saying?
No, I think you've kind of covered it. So, if I have to summarize, respect for others' viewpoints, which means when you're approaching a conversation, approach it with a certain level of compassion and empathy. When you're in the conversation, be curious of what the other person is saying, and you need to have respect for that person and be aware that it shouldn't be, it's a selective respect, right? Because you don't know where the ideas are going to come from, and that's an awareness thing. Once you do that, don't be intellectually overconfident. It's up to us only to decide, but try weigh out the pros and cons. I think that's where the critical thinking comes in. And if you feel that there is something that you need to tweak or maybe go with the other person's point of view, that's when we need to bring in humility. Have the humility to kind of separate the ego from the intellect, right? So yeah, I think in a nutshell, that's what I would say.
Perfect. That's very, very helpful. And I just want to point out, Suman, I think when we are a little more relaxed, all of this becomes easier. When you're stressed, all of the things that we just said, right? When you're cognitively stressed, also become a little harder to do. So being mindful of that as well, right, really helps ease the path to all the points that you just said. So I think
Yeah.
very, very useful discussion for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you. In fact, I keep saying that the soft stuff is the hard stuff.
Yes.
And it's nobody ever said that these are easy, but it requires, and it's a lifelong learning is what I believe.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a muscle that you have to keep building, I think. Absolutely.
Exactly. Great. I think
Awesome.
we are almost out of time. It's been a great
Right.
discussion.
Thanks, folks. Thanks, Sumaya. Thanks.